let's talk about Spelljammer, the campaign box set, aka AD&D Adventures in Space, which sort of matches some of the names for various settings over time, but Oriental Adventures later, Arabian Adventures. The idea that this is the official supplement for playing D&D, so fantasy in space. So it's not one of the sci-fi games that TSR made, basically. It's not Metamorphosis Alpha, it's not... wasn't there another space game as well? I have written on my blog, which you can get to via, I think, the About tab on my channel, about Spelljammer before and the kind of the ups and downs of it and what I do with it. It is I think, a wonderful concept. The basic idea is that you can travel around the Dungeons and Dragons universe between different planets, different systems in the Dungeons and Dragons universe, which are the worlds which are in it. Particularly in this context, the Forgotten Realms, Greyhawk and Kryn, the home of Dragonlance. And you can go around sailing between the stars in this sort of semi-medieval worldview universe. The basic idea is that there are space systems, which are technically they're vacuums with planets in them. The planets have atmospheres, creatures live on them. The planets are based on, or scientifically are based on, the four elements, which are the kind of four core elements of D&D: air, earth, fire, water. And you can travel between them, but you can also travel between solar systems, because each system is inside a shell or sphere, the crystal sphere. You can exit the crystal sphere and go along the phlogiston, a kind of magical oil kind of material based on pre-modern ideas of the universe. It's a bit like stoic fire. It's the fifth element. If you in terms of the film, it's this other element that you can travel between the stars on, and you can go to other systems, and that's how you get to Greyhawk from the Forgotten Realms. And it sort of really functioned in the long run as a dry run for Planescape, a much more successful setting. And the ships you have are controlled by spellcasters. There's lots of strange animals and ancestries out there. So it kind of functions, I think, as a dry run in historical terms for Spelljammer, for Planescape, much more successful. And I think that's a shame, because there's a lot of interesting things about Spelljammer. I think the sailing about on a magical ship in space thing is obviously not replicated by Spelljammer. It assumes kind of a different dynamic. It has a much more swashbuckling feel and an exploratory feel. It's much more in that. It's much more legit than Planescape. Planescape plays this game where it says, look, everything is a philosophical war, and there's issues about how that design actually works out in practice. But the idea that really thought shapes the universe, it's very Pratchettian, very postmodern, I guess. Whereas Spelljammer, it kind of feels though it is, I think, the first campaign box set, if I'm right, if I'm remembering correctly, correct me if I'm wrong, but the first campaign box set for second edition of D&D, because Greyhawk and Forgotten Realms initially just got hardcover books to update various things and to put the gods in. But Spelljammer is this last hurrah, in one sense, of a first edition mindset to do with relative naturalism and mechanical, not necessarily clarity, that's not always true of Gygax, but of mechanical seriousness, and what we'd think of as the kind of mid to late second edition style of being much more, certainly it's much more bulky, much more stodgy, some would say. In that sense, mechanical weight gets added. Second edition is not anywhere near as kind of mechanically stodgier than first, as people sometimes think, I should say. But nonetheless, I think it's a missed opportunity, because there are the box set itself is redeemed by later products, I think, somewhat in the line, but it's a missed opportunity in lots of ways, because I think it ends up as a box set not quite knowing what it's accomplishing or doing, or what its job is. It has an absolute ton of supporting material. The way we'll do this is, I think what we'll do is, it has two books. I'm going to look at the books in more detail. It has Concordance of Arcane Space, 96-pager, and it has Lawbook of the Void, which is a 96-pager too. And it then has a couple of maps. Let's go through some top to bottom. It has a version of the Rock of Bral map, You can get this separately and in more detail in the Rock of Brawl separate supplement, which I have a review of on this channel. It has a map of the living ship Spelljammer, after which this is all named technically, which is an enormous ship. It has a nice scale thing here of, a fairly large, medium-sized capital ship there compared to this. Bigger size-wise than the Yamato or a super aircraft carrier compared to other ships. That it has its own box set later on, which I think is generally considered to be a bit disappointing. But yeah, it has those two. It has a hex star map for combat and things like that. It has a planetary display map, which is including samples of the planet, some of the planetary systems. There's grey space up here. It kind of lets you plot out from the centre of a solar system outward and make up your own systems or use the canonical systems. So yeah, I guess it has 4 maps technically. It then has markers which you cut out for types and shapes of systems to use with things like the planetary display map, though it doesn't quite go one-to-one. You then have 3 cardstock sheets of cutout, no, 3, yeah, of cardstock cutout ships. These are standees. I got this with a couple already punched out or cut out, so you get these little kind of standees, very old-fashioned ones. It feels like you have to pull them back, but there we go. There is that an elven flitter or something? I don't think I can get this to focus reasonably, sorry, due to the light, but there we go. You can see, you put that on the board, that's fun. There are 3 sheets of that. As I say, there's a ton of this, and there's a ton of different ships which we'll get to, but yeah. You then have a lot of ship cards. These are really attractively illustrated, I think often by Brom, but there's a couple of hammer ships. You've got squid ships, and it tells you all about them. They're built by humans, used primarily by humans and lizard men. What kind of magic it uses, what kind of power type, what kind of maneuverability. A tradesman, a dragonfly, nautiloid, dragon ship, wasp, man of war, galleons, because you can use because of the way air envelopes work and the way that magic interacts with vessels, you could use just a ship from your groundling world. Nyogi death spiders, they sound bad, don't they? And Nyogi mine spiders. So you've got all of those. That is a ton of material. That's actually really good. I have very few complaints about the supporting material. I think in terms of both breadth and variety and but also quality, depth, it's very, very good. There are 2 main books, as I say. One is Concordance, is the first book you're meant to read. There you've got a kind of bit of some iconic Brom art there. Brom, who I guess I first think of as to do with Deadlands. Is that one Brom? I don't think that one's Brom, is it? There are a few other Brom ones. I'll get some. Is that Jeff Easley perhaps instead? Jim Holloway for those covers. I should be able to find a decent Brom painting somewhere, because there are some knocking around. But Brom is someone I associate with Spelljammer. Later Dark Sun, and but for me first and foremost Deadlands. But yeah, these are Holloway and Easley are, I think, some of the big colour pieces we can see on this. Yeah, very nice. But yeah, the Concordance is the main rule book. It has a general summary of what's going on. It has general rules of what's going on. 9 pages of just AD&D rules in space. It has, and I'm going to go through this in a moment. It has the stuff about ships and how ships work, rules for ships. It has movement and combat rules. That's more like 20 pages. It has celestial mechanics for systems, generating systems and pre-built ones, and then it has a variety of appendices, including a bit of setting information. And then the law book is sort of a miscellany, but it's sort of more setting side kind of. And DM said it has how to run campaigns in space, adventure ideas. Then it has a long chapter on Spelljammer's detailed stuff on the ships. It then has a chapter which introduces the civilizations of space and has a mini monster manual including new ancestries, new monsters, and then it has a brief tour of the known spheres and other setting bit. So they're each 96 pages, so you're talking about 192, which actually I think I at first thought they were slightly shorter than the Planescape and Birthright box sets, but I think you're talking about the same length. This is going to become or feature as part of the problem. The main rulebook then, Concordance. Yeah, the Spelljammer, by the way, is described as a huge, powerful ship of legend, is the Flying Dutchman of the space lanes, the ultimate goal and dream of many a space pirate and adventurer. Also included is a map of a typical space citadel, so that's the Rock of Braal, a hex grid and standing counters for playing tactical space battles, and an overview of typical solar systems and planetary orbits for diagramming new systems and tracking the planets in a campaign. So arcane space, what do we get on arcane space in the Concordance? We have basic information as to how space works, celestial bodies, wild space, how gravity works. You have a gravity plane coming across the middle of a ship, and basically whichever side you're standing on, that you are up. You then have an air envelope based on the volume of the ship, basically. You have stuff about helms, which are which are kind of magical helms connected to a vessel, which let you, a spellcaster, use their magic to pilot the ship. How crystal shells or spheres work, how phlogiston works, including the effects of various types of flame exposed to phlogiston are as follows. A lit candle creates a 1-die fireball 4 inches across, and a cooking fire is a 4-die fireball 10 feet across, etc, etc. A fireball is 3 times the size and effect of a normal fireball. Stuff about breathing in space, air quality, matters of gravity, temperature and time. Local time often varies, there's no standard time typical. Then we get to chapter 2, rules in space. You start with, this reminds me actually of there's not as much to show you, by the way. You get these sidebars which are sometimes rules and sometimes mostly setting info, but very often setting info that's kind of echoed elsewhere. It's not bad to read. There's some interesting bits and pieces, but often it's a summary of information elsewhere. This reminds me of the Oriental Adventures book and the Arabian Adventures book again, in so much as it positions itself, and to be fair, much like the Player's Guide to Planescape as well, Player's Guide to the Planes, in that it says, look, this is how creating a character is different. It's more like Arabian Adventures or Planescape or Player's Guide to the Planes than it is like OA, because OA kind of positions itself as a not really complete, but basically meant to be an alternative player's handbook. And this is closer to the latter style than the former. It's not complete. You do get a new ancestry though, lizard men, who are short-tempered and emotional, little patience for warm-blooded beings of other races. They have natural armor. They have claws and tails, which can be natural weapons, but they can carry weapons. They can be fighters, thieves, or clerics. They have infravision. Lizards don't always have decent night vision, do they? I'm not sure about that one. But they can swim very quickly. They've got a swim of 12, base move 6. Special races and classes, which just talk about limitations on it. Magic use in space. This is an interesting thing. One of the places, basically this is stuff, if you hate the idea of having extra rules layers, you're probably getting a picture of what you're going to hate about this product, is that so much of this is rules and ways of adapting stuff into Spelljammer. There are limitations to spells which I think are quite interesting though, let's say. The first is a very small one, but the conjuration and summoning that can only work if there is animals like that or creatures like that nearby in the wild space you're in, or in the phlogiston or whatever. Dimensions can't be accessed at all from the phlogiston, for instance, for planar travel, so things that have to do with planar travel are limited based on those factors. Fire works differently in different areas. Even bigger though is clerics, is that basically you cannot get over 2nd level spells unless in a different sphere, unless your god is represented there in some way. And this creates a really interesting, rich setting detail, which is basically that some gods have interstellar followings and they are always influential, like I think Ptah, the Egyptian god of knowledge. Others, and I think maybe some of the Norse gods as well. Others don't, others you'll be like, a Monitor, the powerful, or whatever else, and you go somewhere else and no one knows who a Monitor is. Do you end up going and finding another sun god and pledging some allegiance there? Well, you've got into a different kind of religious posture. There are different kind of, and this actually again feels like maybe half a dry run for some of Zeb Cook's Planescape concepts, that you're like, oh, so religion is different because though people obviously really believe in all the gods and stuff because they know they're real and they know punishments and rewards coming, the way they approach it is different philosophically. Here, because of the ways in which gods are tied to their belief systems within the spheres, they are on Mount Celestial or wherever, but their belief systems, their power is limited by the spheres. You end up having different alliances of gods and different kind of sects that have mutated, you might say, to match the interstellar culture. So on a more Jammer based world or environment, you're going to have different gods. Magic to do with spell jamming, new spells, locate portal, chill fire, enhance rating, that's to do with the ship, well, to do with the helm in fact. Create portal, enhance maneuverability, create minor helm, create major helm, those are the magic user ones. Priests like to create air, contact home power, detect powers, which are finding out who's present in an area. Softwood, which your body is surrounded by soft spongy wood, similar to that of a rotting stump. Create minor helm, they can't create a major helm. Then it has the kind of statistical basis for spelljammers, so spelljammer architecture, much like you get for aerial and naval stuff and fortifications. I'm thinking in first edition too, where it's like, oh, this is how many fortification points something has, whatever it is, ships rating, hull points, that kind of thing. Information about outfitting it. Then a price list with summaries. You can see sort of the length of 6 per page of these ships. We're going to come back to this. There are 3 pages of this, more or less. We'll get back to that because this is an important point that, as I've already mentioned, this is going to come up again in this book. Power sources. The power sources again, so helms are the main way, including some special helms, gnomish helms, Orbus helm, and Orbus is a beholder type that is kind of fuels and drives beholder ships. Series helms, the crown of the stars, which is a magical item. Non-magical engines of various kinds. Furnaces, which are for dwarves. Then you have several pages of weapons, including the gnomish sweeper, which is light ballista, which are fired at the same time with chains that like a sort of put lassos things in. Then you've got armor. Then you've got nautical, and it's kind of renaissancing nautical personal weapons, wheel lock pistols, smoke powder, boarding pikes. You also have Greek fire, and then other spell jamming equipment, planetary locators, star charts. There's a lot of stuff here. You can see that this is a player's handbook, really, in that sense, rather than anything else. Or much of this is functioning as a player's handbook because you've got stuff about, creating ships. About arming ships, about creating characters, about spells, about the things you can go and get, ways of building a crew. There's a lot of detail in the rulebook, which therefore, this, by the way, I hadn't thought of this. This is a really close parallel actually to the way that Oriental Adventures is organised. That essentially, most of that book is a rulebook with very little setting information, and you go and get OA1 Swords of the Daimyo to get a really good sample province. And there's a similar thing, or there's that one Tibetan Adventure and Dragon, or in Dungeon, which is a really useful starter as well. They may be higher level. But yeah, there's something interesting going on here that the assumption is that, first and foremost, and I say this even in Arabian Adventures, it's exactly the same. The idea is that the core book is a rule book. And then if you want setting, and that's player focused because then players will want to buy it, that's at least the later second edition philosophy. And maybe not so much at this time, but later on, is why Birthright has so many Players' Secrets books, because players will buy them all. Whereas if you had a bunch of DM secrets, the DM, well, there's one DM in a group, isn't there? movement and combat is the next section anyway. But yeah, the idea that rules are the main thing you get and not setting is similar in OA, and I think that's not betrays, that's the wrong way to put it, but it shows you the attitude of those first 3 books from first edition and the little brown books as well. The idea that really the world is something that, though it's the most important thing in the entire game, is not what the books are there to provide, and that is going to fall away increasingly over time. By the time you get to Dark Sun or Planescape, you have a lot more writing, often too much writing in a way on the setting, and it's not necessarily usable. It's hard to translate into game terms, but you get lots of stuff from the setting, whereas here you've got incredibly detailed stuff about how how crew status works to do with initiative, morale value. This is a sidebar, morale value for crews and things like that. Then you have a reasonably long section, 20 pages as I say, on movement in combat in space, calculating travel times, movement and facing, turn sequence or initiative, which is very similar in basics to the second edition group initiative system. DM determines what actions the monsters or NPCs will take. The players indicate what they and their ships doing. Initiative is determined. Movements and attacks are made in order of initiative. So the first and second edition initiative process. More stuff about the weapons you can buy, hull points for ships, critical hits, fire, fields of fire, optional rule, morale, optional rule, including all the things that can break their morale. If the first officer is on the deck without the captain, they get +2 to their morale, but if the captain is on the deck, they get +4. There are lots, it is this page here, there are lots of modifiers. That is a page of morale modifiers and situations where you have to take a morale check. Short range combat, rapid resolution of small scale combat. We're still going, and then we get to celestial mechanic, well, repair, in fact, at last. If it's very badly damaged, it costs more per hull point to repair than if it's lightly damaged. There are lots of combat systems, there's lots of stuff here. I think you get the picture, would correctly, I think, get the picture here that I should say the rules are dense but not tough to read. They are coherent, sensible, they are serious rules. They are meant to be used by people who want to play the D&D combat rules. It suits the standees. It's again a rare throwback at this point, given Battle System Second might be out then, which is already kind of assuming that Battle System Second still assumes you're using miniatures, though it's kind of assuming that you don't need standees. You see the shift by Birthright where the war game system is have cards, put them on the table. You don't need to have models, you don't need to have anything of your own. Here it's the bit where it's saying this is a miniature game but will provide you stuff. It's a late period where miniatures, inverted commas, along with Battle System Second as well, are presumed to be something you'll use. Of course, Dark Sun technically does say, oh, we make, and indeed the Maztica setting for Forgotten Realms use Battle System, but those are really chaotic and minority products. Not Dark Sun itself, but the fact that it had Battle System stuff. Who remembers that? I adapted Battle System when running a Dark Sun campaign because I used the Road to Uruk module, which has a bunch of battle information in it, which is relevant. But yes, so here it is a serious game, and that is war game, and that's going to fade out as you go through in second edition. Not in terms of it'll become less serious in terms of combat rules. You get players' options. The 2.5 game basically becomes even more about that. But the idea that you have this fairly serious, sober, dense, technical game that you put out there on the table and move stuff around on, I think that basically goes. And this is one of the last hurrahs. But it shows you the priorities of the game, that the rules are that of a game where there's lots of stuff about the ships, lots of stuff about fighting with the ships, lots of stuff about how air works on the ships and how crew work on the ships. Then you get a chapter anyway on celestial mechanics. I'll go through this quickly, which it's got rules about how you move on that planetary display, for instance, how you lay out your own systems, how you create your own systems, including random generation, how you move around on this map, so that when you're in the system that you've mapped out with your own either canonical system or one that you've generated. There are rules for random generation for systems. You can do that. There's rules for encounter and evasion on the planetary track. I do not think, and I have read these books a couple of times. I do not think there were any encounter tables, properly speaking. Which kind of maybe, let's see if it mentions something here. You may have planned an encounter. Such encounters are left to the DM and override any random encounters. But yeah, I don't think it mentions here any... basic chance for encounter is 1 in 20 modified by certain things. Yeah, I don't think it has any detail on actual random encounters, which is very strange and inadequate. Planetary placement, and then the appendices. There's some useful stuff here. This Appendix 1, lots of spell effects, as in virtually every spell has some comment on it, or it feels like it. It's not quite that much. But say Magic Missile. Magic Missile can inflict hull damage. You can't just get cheap auto hits at a hit point equals hull point damage level, because that will just break the game. You could argue, well, that's not very realistic, is it? But I think there's a point that is, in Star Wars D6 terms, that's personnel level weaponry rather than Walker or Starfighter level weaponry, and so it's just not doing as much damage. Shadow Walk will not function in the Phlogiston as it requires connection with the Shadow Plane, etc. You can't summon certain things. It then talks about a variety of magic items as well, such as the Ring of Shooting Stars always functions normally in space because you're in space. The Lyre of Building can be used to build or repair ships. The Matlock of the Titans can be used to damage hull damage, 1 to every 10 hit points of damage. Travel times and planetary display example again. And then 3 pages on this Rock of Bral place. I've done a review on the Rock of Bral. I'm not going to go into detail here. It's an asteroid where people live. It's a massive spaceport. It's one of the biggest kind of small planets in space. And it's seen as a archetypal, they call it a typical citadel in space. SJR5 Rock of Bral, really good city product. I've got a review elsewhere on the channel. I think it's a good example of something that's going on in this book, that the setting, the core setting, and it is seen as this is where you might start your campaign or end up very quickly in your campaign, gets 3 pages, and I think that's something which is much less than Sigil in the Planescape books. It is, I suppose you could say, it is more than any one kingdom in the Birthright core set gets, which are, well, I said that's some of 4 pages, aren't they, I think. But the core thing about that is that, 1, there's loads of those places, and 2, the idea is that you're going to fill them out yourself. You're going to work with a DM on them, and you get lots of dense information that is much denser in terms of text than that. And you can get the player secret books as well, of course, whereas that there is 1 product for, and that is more or less, along with the Astromundi cluster and a couple of the small bits, the only setting books that you get for Spelljammer. I say that, you get Realm Space, Grey Space, Kryn Space, which are the books associated with those systems. They are not always considered very good products. The lore book, so yeah, you get 3 pages of that, you get all those pages of rules. The lore book is basically another rule book. It is not really a lore book. It is not the setting book compared to this being the rule book, and that again maybe gives us a bit of a warning signal. It does give us an 8-page section on getting into space, getting there, going to space. Here are a number of ways to start groundlings, people who live on normal planets, in their way into space. The Ancient Artifact Part 2. Which, like, you're in a normal dungeon and you find a helm, and you need to find a sage for it. The Ancient Artifact is, there is a ship at the bottom of the Haunted Mines. The scroll is, you find create minor helm scrolls. The sage, you're hired to investigate travel in space. There's lots of ways you could try to do this. Wings of Flying, used to a height never before attempted. A huge tower filled with smoke powder and ignited. The heroes are on the top of the tower within a cube of force. See that, like, that there's a sense, and I think the Dragon art issue dedicated to Spelljammer is pretty good for this too. I think is it Dragon or is it Dungeon? I think it might be Dungeon. But just there's some madcap stuff that mostly works. There's this sense of kind of odd discovery. Aliens from another planet turn up. The envoy, who is visiting, so it could be an arcane. I think the example, it's an arcane who wants to trade, and is going to trade a helm. The crash There's a tradesman from space, which crashes, and they, the thing that destroyed them is coming after you. The crash part 2, or alternatively, is that it's actually a beholder ship instead, or again that it's an elven man of war. The door to get characters in space in a hurry. There's a dungeon door. There's a dimensional hole that goes to a place called the Rock Eye, the Rock of Braal. Space adventures. It gives summaries, paragraph-long summaries generally. You can have an intrigue, exploration, war, pirating, trading, adventuring, and yeah, there's an indication this feels profoundly not thought through. It could be that Jeff Grubb, who's the main writer, had simply, he was trying to summarise information because he'd written so much other stuff, and he'd been told, you've got to get something in about the kinds of adventures, and so he just wants to sum up his experience. It could be they didn't really care, and that Spelljammer for them had mostly been a cool way of putting ships on board and fighting each other. Adventuring is you go around, cruising around, seeing what attacks us. You should have set-piece encounters for this type of group, treasure layers, abandoned dwarven mines, and mixed library with random encounters. Many of the descriptions within this book are intended as springboards to provide interesting adventures and encounters for the characters. That's not what really comes across in the book. It's something where there are no, in this, you get a section shorter than the equivalent in Planescape, the DM book in Planescape, to get people into space. In that one, I think it's a very slight, you get more scenarios though, but in that one you get 2 sample scenarios and a couple of extra comments, and so there is more detail in those adventures, and they are not, the Wizard's Mound one I have used from, the Wizard's Mound one is in Well of Worlds. What is the one in that? In that one I have actually used one of the core book ones for Planescape. They're very short but functional, and they're displayed well. They give you more information than this. This is very much like, here's a general idea, you write everything to do with it. Some of you will prefer that because you'll think, 3 paragraph idea, I'll write a really good adventure. I like a bit more, personally. Then information about how monsters work, going to other planets. Then a whole chapter, a very big chapter, the longest I think, yes I think so, in both books. It is 36 pages long, on Spelljammers. This is the ship section. And each of these is, you get, each ship basically gets a couple of pages. It's not particularly well organised in terms of efficiency. You can see roughly here, there are actually 2 ships there. There's one on this page and one on this page. This picture though, relates to this page. So you get them kind of spreading over. Those 2 are mostly about the squid ship, which is displayed in the corner, but then you get onto the dragon ship. What you get on each of these is who it's built by and so on. And this is information, a lot of which has been, not all of it, and it's not all identical, but has been in the other book. As I say, there are 6 pages dedicated to a price listing, basically, of these. But then it also has a description. It has the kind of crew and what the crew does, the ship uses, and other configurations on top of the average standard configuration. And here you can see this is where part of the stuff you're meant to get adventure ideas comes from, is how a hammer ship would work when it trades, for instance. And then you get some bad guy stuff. The Neogi Death Spider and is the Mind Spider in this one too, are the obvious ones there. The Dwarven Citadel, which is an asteroid with furnaces. There we go. Kind of mountain with a very Warhammerish, actually, isn't it? It feels like. All of this is actually really good. The writing is never exciting in these books, but that is a very functional, useful section. But I am struck by the fact that in the players section you had the price list, you used 6 pages to display ship information, most of which is replicated here pretty much exactly. And there's a surprising thing for such long books with so much information in it, that setting stuff and adventure stuff is squeezed to the edges, whilst rules material is getting doubled up. And there are a few other small instances of this as well, in terms of just reminding you how combat and movement work. That happens in a couple of places. And I don't know if that betrays just genuinely bad editing. I think it actually says something different about the way in which this, as I've already suggested, this product is envisioned. Then you get a section on Spacefarers. This is it gives you lots of details about, and this is actually one of the best sections probably, and maybe the best section in terms of building stuff out of it in the whole set. This is 37 pages, so it is slightly longer actually than the Spelljammer section. It tells you about the various civilizations in the universe. Humans, it talks about, for instance, how faith works among humans. It gives you sample military brotherhoods, the Company of the Chalice, the Pragmatic Order of Thought, the Longfangs, the 10th Pit, the Trading Company. It gives you schools of magic information. It gives you rogue information about how rogues work, adventuring companies and trading companies, including several trading company samples. Other groups, the Xenos, the Seekers. It gives you the Elven Armada information, because you have elves in space, with the Council of Admirals headed by a Grand Admiral ruling from a hidden base called Lionheart. One thing that you sometimes wonder, and Spelljammer never really resolves, is the way, and in general it sometimes addresses it directly but in contradictory ways. That's really what happens, is how come there are groundling civilizations like the Shu who can go into space, but no one else knows about anything that's going on Toril? How come the elves, there's an elven empire in space ruled by the Armada, but there are also loads of elves on Toril, but there doesn't seem to be any kind of real connection between the two? I think there's an interesting thing here. This is actually going to almost run contrary to a general point I want to make, but that really there is a sense sometimes that Jeff Grubb has come up with a bunch of cool ideas about space, because he was told we need a space setting to connect our three worlds, Greyhawk, Forgotten Realms and Dragonlance. And then he's like, oh wow, okay, I'll just make up loads of stuff. This is fun. There's Eldar, basically. There's, I mean, they're not, this isn't grim or anything, but there's Eldar. There's all these factions are made up for the humans. There's dwarves in mountains flying through space. There's lizardmen who are now a playable ancestry. Gnomes who have kind of stuff that doesn't really work. There's halflings. There's goblins. There's Mind Flayer Empire in space. There's special star dragons, all these special rules for undead I'm looking at. Lycanthropes, I'm not sure how legitimate that is. He just thought, I need to write a column about lycanthropes on this 3-column page. Different kinds of star beasts. This is fun, by the way. Star beasts that are said to exist include the following: a single giant holding the world above his head, an air globe held between two giant hands. The arms extend far below the edge of the crystal sphere itself. How would that even work, you wonder? A tremendous beholder holding the flat plane of a world above it with its eye tentacles. A water world held in the grip of a huge squid star beast. A flat world supported on the backs of 4 elephants, which in turn are supported on the backs of 8 dragons, which in turn are held up by a turtle that moves the entire operation around the sun. Not quite Discworld, but obviously the same source. So yeah, there's an issue about how this connects if you're going to have these canonical worlds in it, how that's going to work, because really it doesn't always cohere very well. But that's okay. You can always take the other attitude, and this is one way which I think the Astromundi box set somewhat plays, as does some of the other material, is the idea that really, is it the Astromundi one that does this, that really that stuff doesn't really matter. There is just this one coherent galactic setting where everything kind of connects to each other, and everyone kind of knows what's going on, apart from really primitive civilizations, and that solves that problem really, whereas the way in which the default worlds fit in is perhaps a bit shaky. But yeah, this is really fun, really detailed, really interesting, lots of ideas. You can get lots of campaign ideas from there. That's not quite the same thing as giving you a setting you can run or an adventure you can run, and that is a serious problem. Then the second half of that chapter is the monster manual, and this is very creative. It's not as big as you might like, but then again, it's not the same is true in Planescape. You need the monstrous compendiums, really. Planescape actually is in default, before their own MCs were published, Planescape relied on the Outer Planes Monstrous Compendium MC8. This relies on the 2 Spelljammer ones, pretty much. But yeah, you get here, for instance, for the first time, the arcane, tall, strange, very intelligent traders in space who go around, and who it sometimes hinted to have pretty sinister intentions, but they don't have an empire. No one knows where they come from. Beholders, they're very important in space, and you get basic beholder stats. Just to remind you that you get the Orbis and you get the Hive Mother. So ways in which beholders work in space. They are hive creatures who have specialized subtypes. You have the Drakon, who's a dragon dude, sentient race of dragon centaurs who are lawful good. You have celestial radiant dragons. You've got Elmarins on Elmo's Fire, that is. Ephemerals, non-corporeal undead from the Phlogiston. Gif, another sentient ancestry. Military hippo men. Space whales. What this was surely was this not just before Voyage Home? Was this just after Voyage Home? 89. I'm not going to check, but space whales. You've got krakens. Well, Krajans, who are space krakens. You've got the Nyogi, who are these disgusting kind of spider lobster creatures, short, furry, 8-limbed bodies, serpentine heads with needle-sharp teeth, who basically eat each other and are disgusting and evil. Scavers, who are various kinds of space remora, really, and kind of in a weird, like, long fish-like creatures of space dominated by a single huge human-like eye. And there are different types, including man-eating types and stuff like that. Then we get a very short section, but this is okay, another setting section, the known spheres. I would say it's not at all a problem in person, but the fact that you've got hollow letters on white page with no colour internally. The design of these books is interesting in that it is, again, it feels like one of the kind of last... I mean, I say this, you get some later books into the 90s which are this, you know, are thick but black and white with triple column, but they become rarer and rarer, and you get a lot more like Dark Sun, Planescape or Birthright. That's how the box set generally works. You get 32 page or 48 page sometimes books which are more like this. This is, again, one of the last hurrahs for an old semi-minimalist style heavy text. But yeah, you get basically Kryn Space, for context, is 2.5 pages. Grey Space, I think, is slightly longer. Realm Space is pretty similar. You get the 3 sections, and these give you the planets that are in them. So they give you the most famous ones, so Kryn, for instance, but you also get a column on Kislev, which is a live world. Shulong, or an Earth body sometimes considered a live world. Shulong explorers consider it to be an example of the planetary type that conforms with their 5th element, which for them is not phlogiston, but wood. It's covered with a thick, stormy atmosphere. It's a huge jungle from pole to pole. Plants grow over it. Humanoid and animal life is rare but huge, with giants succeeding as a dominant species. The rest of the humanoids are a little better than barbarians, with wild versions of dwarves, elves, humans, and kender found in tiny pockets throughout the sphere. Dragons do well, particularly green dragons. Grey Space, you've got Earth, of course, but then you have, let's just pick a random one. Ideal is a typical air world with a large number of other elemental bodies spinning through the clear atmosphere. An air world is made of air rather than earth. Fireballs, earth islands, clusters of water droplets. Lots of dragons, and they're social dragons because it's such a dragon-dominated environment. These are, I just think, really creative and fun. Realm Space, finally, let's just end here. And there are lots of other weirder examples than the ones I've semi-randomly picked. Garden, small asteroids linked together by a common atmospheric envelope and by the roots of a single huge plant. The Northmen call the plant Yggdrasil's child, while the Shulong note in their books that Garden is a live world. It's used by a number of races as a place to restock food, water and air. It's also a pirate haven as the mazework of passages falls many large pursuing ships. Or again, Capri is a water world with ice caps at the northern reaches, vegetation-choked equatorial waters. So it's all water, but it does have a sort of Earth-like environment of equatorial verdance and polar iciness. And the Exor Sargasso is a huge bed of floating kelp and seaweed dense enough to support other life. these are just really rich ideas, and I don't mind in this case that they are 2 or 3 paragraphs long for each world. I think, again, I mentioned Star Wars D6 earlier. You know, you think in that second edition revised and expanded rulebook that I've got, if you had anywhere near that number of planets detailed, as opposed to just, I think there's, without checking, there's just a couple. There are, you know, a few, including the sample world, kind of world format. And you have to get the planets compendiums or whatever else to get the other ones. And I think the fact there is just all these ideas there and all these things that you could do. There's a world, I've picked them randomly, full of giants. They're ruled by giants, and there's loads of green dragons there too, and then savage civilized races. But the giants are the ones who are civilized. There's another one where there's clusters of elemental product or base element in an air sphere, and there's lots of social dragons there. There's a kind of a living tree that's grabbed together lots of asteroids, creating this big, because the air envelope develops around it per the physics of it. I think that's so creative, and the fact it's not as detailed does not bother me. Where the Rock of Braal, I'm like, this is meant to be the basic setting. In fact, the cheap way of getting groundlings into space is literally a door to the rock, and you get no more detail than those 3 pages, and you get all this extra detail and rules, including doubling stuff up. But I don't mind in that final case that it is perhaps a bit less detailed. So look, is this a good product? I think you've probably got a lot of my feelings so far on it, and you'll know from what I've said, does dozens of pages of extra rules appeal to you? That's not a kind of rhetorical question. I think for lots of people it won't, and for lots of people it will. In the OSR, we don't always love lots of rules, but some of us do. Those of us who are Whosoite AD&D players, you know, we appreciate some rules. But basically, I've had 2 general views on this product. The first read was, I love the concept, I love the art, I love some of the sections, the stuff on worlds, the stuff on monsters. I liked the ships, to be fair, that's not a problem. I did like the ship details. But it was this weird thing where I came to get a campaign setting where I'd run stuff and didn't really find any setting in it. I found all the enormous amount of rules for space travel and combat. But given I was running, I think when I first read it, BX / OSE and 5th edition of Dungeons and Dragons, the rules would need a lot of work or simplification or changing to really make useful. And I don't mind doing a bit of that. I don't mind stealing ideas for rules, but it meant it wasn't a product I was just going to say, the majority of this is going to make it into my game. And what it was as inspiration was limited by the lack of setting. But on a second time through, because I'm now running 1st and 2nd, and this, I think it might even say at the start of Concordance, you can use it to run 1st edition material. There's a lot more here for me to love, and that will be true for you if you are using more advanced versions of the game. The rules are not bad if you're willing to run or adapt them. They're actually pretty functional. Certainly compared, I've talked about this with Birthright, where some of the systems seem like they were half play tested and have been half written down. Even though they're interesting rules, they don't completely work, and I think that's different here. These rules are serious rules on the whole. It's very strong for the sheer amount of stuff you get on the ships themselves, for the way in which magic works in that changed environment in space. Planescape is similar for that, I should say. It gives you lots of information to run a naturalistic world, albeit in space. But there's still the strong sense that this is an incomplete product. You get tons of dense rules, you get all the accessories. As I say, the accessories are great. You get this hint that you might go and play in space. You get some basic concepts of getting into space, but you don't really get any material for that campaign. You're told, oh, you might pick up some ideas just reading about ships, I guess. It feels like a real cop-out. You don't get proper encounter tables. You don't get a real locale. And yeah, 3 pages is enough to develop something, don't get me wrong, but there's still a sense that you're like, for all the material, for 192 pages, you could get more than 3 pages on the core locale they're going to use. On the other hand, and this is denser text than many of those later box sets which have better setting material. On the other hand, you know, it's different in terms of, you know, it uses a lot of pages, and it's somehow even less setting than shorter settings. I've said it's similar, you know, it has less setting than similar length settings, but it has less setting material than FR First or Greyhawk Second, which is the first box set, which both have much more setting information. Very different formats actually to each other. Forgotten Realms is much more what we think of as a setting book for good and for bad, whereas Greyhawk is a weird mixture of things that Gary, I think, half threw together. One other issue I should say in terms of how you run this, and this is not really a criticism morally, but just technically, or practically, I should say, is that this is really the monsters. I'll get some up actually. The monsters and the spells are, and the ways in which you're generally creating helms and repairing stuff, are really aimed at mid level. So let's say you should be starting at 5th to 7th. Without checking one of the books, that is what you find, I think, in both of the kind of low level modules you get. Really are assuming you've got lots of characters who are around 4th, 5th, 6th level. But you know, you're fighting beholders to start with. Dracons have 6 HD, Arcane have 10 HD, Celestial Dragons 15, Elmarins 5, 7 or 9, GIF 4. In fact, looking at the sentient ancestries is a good way to kind of get an idea of how tough they're meant to be. A standard Neogi is 5 HD. And yeah, you could just have stuff where you really have them operating in areas with much weaker enemies. You know, lots of goblins, lots of humans. That's legitimate. That is in the setting. But the idea, the difference Planescape has is that Planescape says first level characters can go to Sigil and they can deal with all kinds of weird stuff. And at those low levels, they operate in Sigil, and this is how. And then they go out to the planes. There are issues with how that works, but that is a concept which means that players immediately get involved in the weird stuff. Spelljammer gives you no obvious way of doing that. You can make up some stuff, but it's not really clear how that would be as enjoyable as giving them a whole gamut. I've suggested elsewhere that really what you want to do, I mean, there's 3 things. You can either organically get there, that's fine, run a campaign for long enough, they go up into space. They can, this is 2, you can just create characters at 6th level, 5th level, whatever. Or 3, and this is what I think the pure Spelljammer campaign, if that's what you want it to be, a 1st to 20th level, 1st to 10th level campaign, is you have them start on the Rock of Brawl, you get SJR 5 Rock of Brawl, and you start them doing missions on the Rock of Brawl, investigating stuff there, factional stuff there, and taking jobs into space. And so they get introduced into all the weirdness, but as Spelljammer groundlings. They get to become, much like use Sigil in Planescape as a relatively safe-ish low-level sandbox. By safe-ish, I mean in terms of you're not sending first-level people to fight Asmodeus. This idea that they are dealing with stuff that they can engage with at a peer level. And I think you can do that in Spelljammer, but it's not made evident, I think, that that's what you should do. Ultimately, to make this box set really good, I mean, I'm assuming this is something where you've heard, I can cope with the rules, I don't mind the rules, in fact, that sounds interesting, I want to use the resources, which is where I'm at on it. Then I think the next thing is to say, well, how do you fix the glaring problem of setting? And the glaring problem of setting, I think, is fixed by the fact that this needed to come with SJR 1 Lost Ships by, I think it's one by Ed Greenwood, or SJR 5 Rock of Brawl by Richard Baker, or both. I'm being somewhat flippant. That'd be an enormous product, but it says something that you need. Lost Ships is extra ships, but lots of low-level adventures and adventure ideas and seeds associated with different ships. Rock of Brawl is a big city book, a bit bloated, but excellent, as I've already suggested. So yeah, I think that's what I'd point people towards, is I'd say you need those products to create the basic Spelljammer experience, to say that this is the basic gel. I've written some stuff. I think you need to also, to make it really work, there are probably a few steps beyond that. There is, but then it's the same for Planescape, it's the same for Dark Sun, frankly. A lot of these non-standard 2nd edition settings, Birthright, require more engagement from a DM to make, not just okay, but really good. In a way that vanilla fantasy sets up so many tropes and so many normal systems of operating that it's a lot easier. I think these things are harder. I have written a bit about that, as I say. But yeah, I think Spelljammer is it is a frustrating, and it is a beautiful, and it is an incomplete, and it is a worthwhile product. I would not want to join those who see it essentially as a disappointment. It is a disappointment in some respects, but if you come wanting the kind of early second edition, late first edition, design theory, late naturalism in D&D, kind of an interest in crunch, even if you're adapting it heavily, and that the crunch all serves, and it does genuinely serve, the naturalistic depiction of fantasy space, and naturalistic in the Gygaxian sense depiction of fantasy space, then I think it's an excellent product. It's incredibly creative. Once you add in a few products, once you add in the monstrous compendiums, once you add in Lost Ships, is it Skulls and Crossbows SJA1? I think that is. Once you add in Rock of Brawl, a couple of other things, there's one or two other products that are really worthwhile as well. Once you add those in, you actually have as serious and complete a world as any other. It just perhaps needs a bit more pulling together from the DM, in my view. I have players messing around on the edges with Spelljammer at the moment, and I'm excited to get them more into space. And in, I should say, actually in one of my, and this is the alternate recommendation, in my Dunwallwood campaign, I have had players go into the Planar Compass Astral Sea, which is a mixture of Planescape, which is Planar Compass is the zine, is obviously a mixture of Spelljammer and Planescape, and I really enjoyed that too. That is a really interesting alternative to Spelljammer in simpler games. But yes, if you have run Spelljammer, if you've played in it, do tell your war stories in the comments. I'd love to hear them. Tell me what you thought of it as a product. And yeah, just generally fantasy space, and that kind of era of second edition where they're just throwing out ideas. Let's get talking about that. Till next time.